Story time with Stephanie Story.
Hi, I am art historical novelist Stephanie Storey. Welcome to my show. This is Story Time. My guest here today, I've known for quite a while, a couple of years, just from events and seeing her out and about. And I'm so excited for everybody else to be able to read her debut novel, which comes out very shortly. We're going to talk about historical fiction and Italy and brilliant women from history and writing process and all kinds of things. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here, Diana Giovinazzo.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so looking forward to this interview.
And I said in the introduction, or I said when you got here, you do this, and then I forgot to mention that you also have your podcast, Wine, Women, and Words, with your friend Michelle. So yes. You do this on the flip side all the time. Before I ask you about your book, since this is your debut novel, are you looking forward to being the subject of these interviews now? This is going to be
I am, and at the same time, it's a little weird because I'm the one who normally asks the questions. So I'm like, okay, you're going to start asking me these questions, and I'm going to have to answer and come up with, coherent answers to these questions. Now I know what all my authors feel like.
Awesome. Okay, I will ask you more about that later, but first things first, we have to get to Anita, who is your fabulous protagonist of this beautiful novel that comes out soon. Anita Garibaldi. She's, for those of you at home, she's a great revolutionary in South America, Brazil, Uruguay, right? And Italy, of course.
Of course.
But you tell us in your own words who she is and why the people at home have to know about her.
Well, as you mentioned, she is a revolutionary. We start off in Brazil in her childhood, where she was a gaucho and just defied societal norms. She met Garibaldi, her husband Giuseppe Garibaldi, in Brazil. She fought a war with him, and then they go to Uruguay and they end up fighting together in another war. And then she goes off to Italy with him right at the start of basically Italian unification. And she goes off with him to help him form a unified Italy. And she dies while she's there in the midst of all of this. And she's just this incredible woman who inspired me, who had this story that just needed to be told. And when you look at the writings of Garibaldi, that everybody writes about him and how much of a great leader he was, and they always put her as a footnote in his story. And it's so unfair, and it's so not what he would have wanted, because he was so madly in love with her. Years after she died, he called her the queen of his soul and the woman he still wept for. She had that much of an impact on his life and helped him become the man who he was. And yet nobody knows anything about her.
Why do you think everybody shoves her into a footnote? Because at least the way you describe it, she's got this amazing life and it's dramatic and there's all of this stuff, like it's crazy, and she's the driver of a lot of it. She's the driver of so much of it. So why do you think history, is it just because she was a woman, or were there other factors that she got overlooked? What do you think?
I think there were some other factors that were involved in it. I think he is such a grand personality that he had a tendency to just kind of suck the air out of the room. And I think there was an effect of that within history of everybody was like all about Garibaldi and all about what he did and what he accomplished. And so that, I think, played a major part in her getting a bit diminished. And there was a lot, I think, sexism that goes along with it too. She was a woman, she was the wife, she was relegated to the wifely duties, the mother of his children. That's all that was really needed.
Okay, so how did you find her, get obsessed enough with her? Because writing a novel, I don't know if you know this, Diana, it's difficult.
Yeah, just a little bit. Just a little bit.
How did you get obsessed enough with her to know that you had to go write a book about her?
Oh, from the very moment I read her first biography, I became obsessed. Literally, I was in the first chapter and I started taking notes. The first line of the book, Bad Omens, Follow Me All My Life. that was the first note I ever wrote about the book when I read it. Because I was reading this book and I was like, wow, her biography. And I was like, wow, a lot of bad omens here. And I was like, oh, bad omens follow me all my life. Huh. And then it was just, I started taking notes and started becoming encouraged. But to go backtrack a little bit further, when I started, before I started writing this, I got very interested in my family history. My great-grandparents immigrated here respectively, one in 1912, the other one in 1914, 1915, roughly, just before World War I. And I was really interested in their story and how they got here. And then that turned into, well, why? Why did they leave Italy? What was happening in Italy that made them come over here, along with this there was a massive population move from Italy to the Americas, United States, and South America. I have distant cousins I found out in Venezuela that I've never met that ended up in Venezuela, because there's a big Italian population in Venezuela as well. And so I got really interested in this, and I was talking to my father about it, and he was like, you should really look into Giuseppe Garibaldi and his wife Anita. And after a quick, Google search, I was like, but she's Brazilian. How does that relate to what I'm looking at? So I'm looking, focusing right now on the United States portion of it. And he's like, just pick up a book. Just pick up a book. You'll be interested. And so I did. I picked up the book, and I just, from the very first moment, I just became obsessed with her. This idea of who she was and how much of a revolutionary she was, in equal parts with Giuseppe. And she's this huge feminist icon that I think the world needs right now.
So prior to the pandemic we're all living through, and all of the protests around George Floyd and all of the racial unrest, the biggest story on the planet was the Me Too movement.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I was thinking about that movement a lot when I was reading your book, because mm-hmm. There are these moments, I'm not going to give any of your plot away, but there are these moments when she is subjected to certain things, and she has to overcome and mm-hmm. and fight back. Did you have a perspective? Were you writing this when the Me Too movement was happening? Did it have an effect, or did writing this change your perspective on that moment? Either one.
That's kind of like chicken before the egg. Which came first? Mm-hmm. With this story, it was a lot of I think there was some stuff that started to play into it, because I started writing this about 4 or 5 years ago, so it was right at the very cusp, but right at the very beginning of when that was happening. And I could see as the stuff was happening, it was also like, well, she went through this kind of thing as well in different points. And wow, because you get into the mindset of your characters when you're writing fiction, and writing historical fiction, I feel like, is special because you're also getting into the mindset of a historical figure. And it was like, well, what would she think about this? How would she feel about this? And even going into the stuff happening right now with the pandemic and everything going on, I had to sit back and think, well, what would they think about this? And I can tell you they'd be out there protesting right along with everybody else. No, they would be a part of this movement, especially because they were very much about equality for everybody, regardless, race, gender, whatever.
Have you always wanted to write? Tell me a little bit about, I've met you, we've talked, but I don't know much about your writing journey. How did you has it always been something you wanted to do? And when did you finally decide you were going to do it? Tell me a little bit about your writing journey.
That writing journey is very twisty. It was never an A to B, like, okay, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to write this, and it's going to happen. I'm going to go to school for this, and it's going to happen. It was the long way around, very much so, because for as long as I can remember, it was all about storytelling. Always, always, always about reading and about storytelling. And I mean, my first memory was reading to my grandfather, making up Teddy Ruxpin stories. Everybody, Teddy Ruxpin was a huge influence. It was all about Teddy Ruxpin. I played with him until his face fell off, literally. And I had the book, and I didn't know how to read yet, but I remembered the stories. So I would tell the stories, and then I would make up the stories as I went along when I was telling these stories to him. And it just kind of grew from that. It was just always a part of who I was. Writing and reading was always a part of who I was. And then, naturally I get to college and I major in sociology and English. I'm sorry, not English, sociology and anthropology. And I majored in that. naturally. Yeah, it makes total sense. And then I, after I got out of college, I was like, all right, I'm going to give this an honest go. My husband was active duty in the military, and I didn't have a steady day job. We had moved somewhere else, and I was like, all right, I'm going to do this. I'm going to write a book. I was about 25 or so, and I fell on my face, and I failed miserably. I completely failed. Nothing happened with it. It was just, and I was like, that's it. I'm not going to be a writer. I had my chance for my dream. It's not going to happen. Some people are meant to read books, only books, and I'm terrible, and this is what's going to happen. And right about that time that I quit, and this is one of those things that I will always, always, always love Michelle for, and that's why what she's mentioned in the thank yous because of this was right about that time where I was like, I'm not going to be a writer. And because we just moved back to California and time to get a real job, be an adult and all of that. And she and I met, we bonded over books. We worked in a terrible call center. We traded books back and forth. And she, for some reason, there was like some anthology contest that came up, some writing contest. And she was like, you know what? Let's write stories and exchange them. Because she was always about being a writer as well. And I was like, no, I'm not a writer. She said, we won't give it to anybody. We'll just for ourselves. Just for ourselves. So I wrote this little story, this little sci-fi fantasy story, steampunk, of course, because, historical fiction. And I exchanged it with her, gave it to her, and she was like, oh my God, why aren't you writing? And I was like, because I'm not a writer. I tried, I failed, it's not for me. And she was like, no. You need to be a writer. This is what you need to do. You need to write. And so she, in her infinite wisdom that she didn't just tell me that I needed to be a writer. She would go on Twitter. She would find articles, tag the authors of the articles, and be like, see, Diana, here's something to beat that excuse. And the author of the article would be like, yeah, listen to your friend Diana. And that's when I slowly started getting back into writing. I started blogging first, and then I picked up at first it was fantasy. I picked up a fantasy novel because I like reading fantasy. And then Anita came, and the rest is history.
What was the big failure? You wrote one and it didn't get published?
I wrote short stories. I wrote one that was like half finished. That was, in retrospect, it was god awful.
But I have 8 god awful novels in a filing cabinet somewhere. Like, I'm trying to figure out what the big failure was in your mind, so that people at home who are watching going, I've had this huge failure, will listen to you and go, oh, never mind, maybe I'm like Diana.
I couldn't get published. That was my big failure. I couldn't get published. I couldn't get traction. Nobody would pick up the short stories. Nothing. None of it would get picked up.
At 25, when you were a baby.
Yeah.
When you were a child, and you're thinking, oh my God, my life's over because I can't be a writer because no one will publish me.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's when I was like, all right, time to be an adult, get a degree that was useful. And yeah, I went and became a paralegal for 10 years while I was also being a writer. So until I actually got the writing actually became the full-time job.
You were talking about your husband's active duty military.
Mm-hmm.
And that made me think about this book, because so much of it is about warfare and revolution. I mean, there's so much of that in it. Did you use stuff from your life with your husband or knowledge about the military in this book?
I did. He and I had long discussions about the commander part of it, because he was a captain in the Army. And so I was like, hey, this and this would happen with, Garibaldi, and these things happen, in this situation. I'm trying to wrap my head around this. How would you perceive this? What's the military mindset of this? Because when you look at a soldier, there's a different military mindset. That is, it's not that it's not a bad military mindset, but you have to sometimes take yourself away from the standard. It's all about me mentality, and you have to have it. It's about the greater good, and about, if I die tomorrow, that's fine, because it'll be better for my country, for my people, etc. And so there's, elements of that going in there, and the relationship of her being a military wife. Because, face it, she was also a soldier and she was also a military wife. And I knew a lot of those when we were active duty that were both the husband and the wife were active duty. And, so I had to pull that into it. And, her relationship with him and what it's like having to deal with a soldier who's a husband. And that came into their relationship as well. And there were some points where there's one probably specifically that I'm thinking of that you're probably also thinking of too, when it comes to the emotions and her emotions with dealing with something that was completely and truly heartbreaking, and what it was like for somebody having seen all the things that she had seen going up to this point and having to face that.
Since we're both historical novelists,
Mm-hmm.
how did you make determinations on how far to stretch artistic license on that front and others, where you're mining your own emotions and you're mining your own knowledge today versus what was historical fact? How did you navigate that line? Because I think every historical fiction writer has to navigate it.
Yes, it's true. It wasn't really a conscious decision with her story, where, plot-wise, there really wasn't much that I changed, that I had to change. There was only a couple parts in there that really, for logistical plot reasons, otherwise the story would end up going on for another 300 or 400 pages, that I condensed some things. I had to do that because there were a lot of little battles in Brazil, the logistics of going from Uruguay to Italy, that sort of thing. But emotional wise, I was able to come across a book that actually had her, I don't want to say memoir, because for most of the time she didn't read or write for most of the story, and I try to put that in there in the book as well. But she didn't read or write, and so she told the story to her friend Feliciana, and that person was actually a person, and they actually sat down, and she, because of her, and that's why I made sure to put her in the book, is because that's why we have a memoir and a record of Anita's thoughts and as she went through all of this. So we got to see what she thought about these things that she experienced firsthand. So I got to use a lot of that as my rule book for her emotions within that story.
Okay, so if there's this much knowledge out there and you feel like you didn't have to change very much,
Mm-hmm.
why did you choose to write a historical novel and not nonfiction? What was the determining factor for you? I think everybody goes through this argument too in their head.
Yeah, they do. For me, I feel like I'm really terrible about writing nonfiction. Before we started this, I was already like, oh my God, I've got all these essays I've got to write. Fiction comes naturally to me. That's what I prefer. That's what I love. Maybe I'm a daydreamer. That maybe it's because I love to put myself in these other shoes. It's something that just comes naturally to me for a mindset when it comes to writing. And so I feel like that that just came to me that this is why I have to do historical fiction. And also when you do historical fiction, you figure out what it's like to feel. If I could write a historical book about, I've got this major tome right now about Napoleon, and it gives me, okay, this and this happened, this and this is what they said, here's some, examples. But it really doesn't tell me what Napoleon felt like, how truly angry he was over the situation. In historical fiction, people who read fiction have a tendency to be more empathetic towards others. And I feel like with historical fiction, we have a tendency to be more empathetic when it comes to history. And it gives us more of an insight, I think, into humanity.
So you are one of the most passionate people I know on the subject of Italy. And I know that comes from a family connection.
Mm-hmm.
But do you know what it is? Like, I love Italy, but I love Italy because of the art. Like, I understand why I'm so invested in the country and the culture.
Uh-huh.
Is it just family history, or is there something else that you relate to and connect with the country and the culture beyond your own family history?
I connect a lot with the culture of it, and it's hard to put into specific words about what specifically it is within the culture. that I connect to, because I remember, kid you not, my dad, when I was a little girl, he sat me down. He's like, "You are very, very lucky. Not everybody gets to be Italian, but you get to be Italian." And so I think with the culture in and of itself, there's just something, I feel like being Italian is just kind of special. We were raised with this idea that we're special, and being an Italian is special. And so being raised with that, you have this sense of pride of being like, I get to be from Italy. I get to be Italian. I get to claim this food and this history and this culture as my own, because it was what my people did or what my people had. And so much of that is just ingrained in us, that is just part of every day, to the point where my own husband, who is not Italian, is referred to as Italian by association.
Okay, you were supposed to go to Italy this fall, or did this
spring?
Actually.
Yeah, June I was supposed to be there. Yeah.
Obviously, none of us are going to Italy right now.
Yeah, unfortunately.
But when you go back,
mm-hmm.
what's first on the list to go and see this time? Because I know you've been there before, but this
mm-hmm.
time, what's highest and most important on the list, particularly after finishing this guy?
Anita's grave. Anita was buried in Rome. She is buried in Rome. There's a statue to her. Jennicum Hill is where she is, where there's this trail going all the way up to the top. And it's really beautiful, where it starts with Anita at the base of the hill. And going up the hill is the people from Unification, the heroes and stuff. And at the top of the hill is Garibaldi. And her statue is where her remains were. She was cremated and she was buried at the base of the statue. She was actually originally buried in Nice, where Garibaldi was originally from. And Mussolini, actually in the 1930s, went there, got her remains, and brought her back to Rome. And that's where they did the statue. And they did the statue there. And that's the first thing. That was going to be the first thing when I went to, where it's like, I had this urge, where I feel like it's very much an Italian thing too, where you have to pay your respects to somebody. You got to pay your respects. I mean, my own grandmother used to she used to check the funeral boards to make sure that there was nobody there that she knew, because if she knew, she'd have to go in and pay her respects. My mom would be sitting out on the steps with the groceries melting while she went in there and paid the respects, because she knew Joey, because Joey was, the butcher, that she used once ago, a long time ago, but you got to pay your respects. And so that was really important to me I was like, okay, we got to go. I want to go, we were able to work it out so I could go before the book got published, so I could get those great pictures, but also I could go and pay my respects to her, because it's a real person. You're dealing with a real life. And there was a lot of respect that, I wanted to approach this from, really respectfully, and I wanted to go pay my respects. And then, pandemic happened.
How is our global pandemic treating you creatively? I just hear like two different sides. I hear some people are completely distracted and they can't work and it's awful and they're like beating themselves up because they can't work. And then other people are able to sort of absorb the moment and use it to fuel them. Where are you on this spectrum of how it's treating you creatively?
It's fueling me. Weirdly enough, I'm doing the feel like I have a tendency, like I'll allow myself a certain amount of time on the news, and then I have to cut it off. And I have my office, as you can see in here, which is my own little secluded hideaway. There's no TV in here. I can play music in here. Everything I need and want about being creative is in this room. And so I just kind of get in here, close the door, and just literally shut the world out so that I can create. And it's interesting because the next book, my main character goes through 2 pandemics in her story. As a child, she goes through one, and then the same illness comes back around, another wave, and takes away, kills her children. And so it's, I kind of, got to be in that world, and she was like somewhat quarantined for a while. And I'm like, I know exactly what this feels like.
This is not actually out yet, so you're on the precipice of this.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel about watching this? Where is your headspace? Is it, oh my God, this is the greatest thing ever? Oh my God, I'm terrified. Is it a mix of all of those things? Where are you at emotionally?
I think there's a little bit of disbelief still. A little bit of this is really happening to me. This is really going to happen. The little girl at like 6 years old is actually going to get a book published. It's still, there's still that bit of surrealness to it, and then just the just sheer excitement of, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on this, but I really effing did it. I finally effing did it.
Story time with Stephanie Storey. Story time virtually. We've got time and plenty of stories, talking stories in a novel way. Story time with Stephanie Storey.